welcome to our second episode of Healthy Politics, where we're going to discuss the eternal intersection of healthcare in the United States and American politics. My name is Nick Carls. I'm a benefits director director of compliance here at Holmes Murphy. And with me is former president of Holmes Murphy and healthcare strategist extraordinary, Den Bishop. Say hey, Den.
Hi, Nick. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. How about yourself?
Good. Lots of changes since our last talk.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things Den and I were talking about before we started here was today we're really just going to focus on the things that we can talk to as experts. A lot of insane stuff has happened over the last 3 weeks, and there are some podcasts that would be much better, or different types of platforms that'd be much better at getting into the nitty gritty on that stuff. We're going to leave it to those experts. Today we're just talking about politics and healthcare. So with that little preamble out there, where do we start? Do we want to start with Harris, or do we want to start with JD Vance?
Well, I think that the two biggest changes relative to healthcare and politics are the addition of JD Vance to the ticket on the Republican side and the movement to the top of the ticket of Kamala Harris on the Democratic side. So I think our talk today is really around those two moves and what does that potentially do to the position of each party in this election.
Sure, absolutely. And I think I'll jump in with the JD Vance part because I think it's actually super interesting. Again, you guys are gonna have to bear with us. Den and I nerd out on this kind of stuff. But when I saw that it was JD Vance, I remember back in 2017, I actually remember this, him saying, we're not going to get rid of the current attempt to repeal and replace is not great for the folks in Ohio. He didn't support the repeal and replace. And then since then, he's kind of taken something of almost a hands-off approach to the Affordable Care Act, right? Where he never says that he loves it. He doesn't think it's great or anything like that. He thinks some changes should be made, but he doesn't say anything about replacing it. Doesn't say anything about repealing it. And so Trump's selection of JD Vance, I think, is sending maybe a little bit of message, or maybe it's not. I mean, it's hard to be sure, right?
It does feel like a move to the middle a bit for the Republican Party in their position. But again, Vice President Pence was also more of a moderate on this issue. But I do think that it is, from a healthcare platform perspective, definitely is not a move to the hard right, repeal and replace. It is more a move to the, hey, let's make what we have work better. Now, I have no idea what they're going to say to make work better. I don't know if you have insight on that, but I do think that it is a move to the middle on the Republican Party.
Yeah, and that was the hard part. So for the last, I would say, week or so, right? I've been just checking the news every single day, trying to see if there are some new position statements from Trump, from the Republican Party, anything like that on healthcare. And it's silent, right? I mean, we're really going off of past statements. The last time that Trump really said anything was back in 2023. Where, once again, he said the ACA was garbage and he was going to replace it. And when that happened, all the senators, a lot of people in Congress went, we have no plans to do that, right? And that's the last I've heard.
Yeah, the plan was going to be phenomenal, better than anything we had ever seen. We just didn't know what it was. We still don't know what it is. But, my terminology for the Republican stance used to be, they would say repeal and replace, but it really felt like the stance was repeal and erase.
Yeah.
There hasn't been anything concrete on the Republican side to say this is exactly what they would like to do. I think with JD Vance as the vice presidential candidate, what it means is I don't think it will be a repeal and replace. That would not be his stance. I think it would be let's make cost reforms.
Sure.
And typically the Republican stance on healthcare is more choice. How can we add choice? How could we control costs? How they would do that, I think we're going to have to wait and see what they come out with. But I think that is the direction that they're headed.
Yeah, and I think we touched on this a little bit in the first episode. The enhanced subsidies for plans offered through the exchange. That's coming up for renewal, right? So if you have a Trump Vance ticket and they're elected or whatever, that's a subtle change that you can see happening, right? They just don't support it. They don't sign off on any kind of expansion or continuation of premium subsidies for the exchange. Okay, so those are things that we can look at that without them even having to say. You're like, I'm pretty sure that's going to happen. It'd be a very strange day if they push that type of continued enhancement.
And to reiterate, for those that watched the Republican National Convention, healthcare was not a topic. It was more around all other issues, but they really stayed away from the health insurance side of things.
100%. I always wonder if that's partly because some of the American public is finally starting to understand things about pre-existing condition exclusions, out-of-pocket limits, stuff like that. I mean, it's a somewhat easy message to understand, and so it's better to be silent on it unless you have, to your point, some really good new idea.
Yeah. So why don't we flip to the Democratic side with the move up the ticket of Vice President Kamala Harris to the top of the ticket, and maybe I'll take lead off on that and talk a little bit about we know a lot about what candidate Harris when she was a senator.
Yes.
So if you kind of trace back the history of where she has been, she was, as senator, a co-sponsor of Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All legislation. So she was fully on board as a senator with that. As a presidential candidate, if you kind of took early in when we had a lot of people running against now President Biden as a candidate in 2020. I would have ranked on the healthcare issue. I would have ranked Senator Kamala Harris as probably the second most progressive or second most left to Bernie Sanders. He was by far the leader on the Medicare for All side. She was probably second in line as a co-sponsor of the legislation. In one of the debates, she affirmed her position. She later softened, never really came out as a candidate with how she would pay for a Medicare for All world that got rid of private insurance. She had a famous quote that wasn't necessarily positive, received positively about her opinion on private insurance as a candidate.
Yep.
So I think if we move from her as a candidate, when she became vice president candidate, then she really kind of took a back seat on the healthcare policy to President Biden's now known platform of let's protect and advance Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act. That has been the current administration, and they have done that well by enhancing the subsidies that we've already talked about. So for people who receive a subsidy, they pay a lot less for insurance because taxpayers are paying more for more of that bill. I do think with Vice President Harris, if she were to become President Harris, what do we think would happen? My opinion is to get elected, I believe she will move more to the middle than where she was as a candidate in 2020. I don't think that we're going to see a quick resurrection of Medicare for All as a platform. I do think, and again, we'll wait and see. We don't know who her vice presidential candidate is yet, but I do think that if Vice President Harris were to become President Harris, I could see some things that would expand Medicare's role in terms, not necessarily a Medicare for All, but potentially a public plan option, a Medicare opt-in choice, something along those lines that would be another step towards eligibility for everyone into Medicare. Again, it would depend on who controlled the House, who controlled the Senate, but we do know from her history that has been her stance.
Yeah, well, and we have to recall just how much she had to walk back her comments, right? She was talking about like get rid of all private insurance. Like yes. Absolutely, she didn't say worthless, but more or less she's saying they're worthless. They're harming us.
Her direct quote when asked in a debate was, "Let's just move on." It was we just need to leave that in our history and move on. But she did clearly try to walk that back. The public reaction was not positive to her comments, so she did walk that back. And as vice president, has really remained silent on the issue.
But what's interesting is she had to walk it back because we'd just gone through all of that change with the Affordable Care Act, right? People were still reeling from if you like your plan, you can keep it. Just seeing all sorts of changes in the way that healthcare was being delivered, because that's what the Affordable Care Act did, right? It made pretty significant changes. Well, not delivered, but how we're paying for it. Their interactions with their employer, with private insurers. One of the things that you've talked about in the past, and when I've had some of these discussions with you, is the potential if healthcare costs continue to balloon, right? If we get into 2026 and inflation's cooled everywhere else, but it continues to go through the roof on,
Yeah, let me interrupt real quickly on that. There was an article that came out last week from PwC on healthcare costs, and they are projecting the highest rate of inflation since before the Affordable Care Act was passed, and they upwardly adjusted the healthcare inflation rate for the past 2 years and said they actually understated it. So employers are now facing the highest rate of healthcare inflation they've seen in well over a decade.
yeah. And so let's just play pretend for a second here and say it ends up being a Harris presidency, right? And we're looking at this, and medical inflation's far outstripping all other types of inflation. There's a pretty easy platform then, right? To say, look, this isn't working. We're going to say, hey, employer, if you want to, you can pay something similar to the pay or play tax that we have right now under the employer mandate, but you can get out of the healthcare game and your employees can go to this expanded public option or something like that. That kind of just dipping your toe in, subtly doing it or whatever. And right now, it doesn't sound so far-fetched, right? We're far enough away from the Affordable Care Act implementation that I think people are finally willing to entertain something new or novel.
Yes, if there's any one thing in politics that's popular, it's Medicare.
Yeah.
Everybody celebrates when they turn 65, not because they turn 65, but because they finally get eligibility for Medicare, which costs less because the government heavily subsidizes the costs and controls the prices. So Medicare is popular. Neither side is going to say they're going to cut back Medicare, do away with Medicare. That's not going to happen. You don't get elected if you say that. But I do think if we just kind of take in total and say, okay, all we've talked about here, where has the Republican Party moved with Vice President Vance? They have moved to the middle, from the right a little more to the middle. That even on a Republican side could lead to more choice. What does more choice look like? It could be access to maybe things that might be considered government price controls in the past, linking what we pay to what Medicare pays. Prescription drug, one area especially for you, I know in your expertise in compliance, there's the reduced drug prices that are coming into place next year. That is only for Medicare plans, not for all of our clients. I think we could see both parties want to see if they could expand that and get drug prices under control, be popular with voters. And I think we could see that from Republican or Democratic sides.
Right. And I think it's important that we remember that there have been different platforms within the Republican Party that have talked about getting rid of employer-sponsored coverage, right? McCain had a time where he was saying, let's get rid of employer-sponsored coverage, get rid of this tax break, and let's just have individual plans, right? So there's still an appetite for it, I think. Now, whether or not both parties would find compromise, come together, hold hands, and
that we'll wait to see. So we've got the Republican Party has moved a bit to the middle. The Democratic Party has moved a bit to the left, the more progressive side. That, I think, is the big one-sentence summary of what's happened with the changes in the last 2 weeks. A move to the middle by the Republicans, a move to the left or progressive side on the Democratic side, just based on a change in who's at the top of the ticket.
And I know we're trying to kind of wrap up and provide a summation here, but one of the things I do think is interesting, kind of going back to what I was just saying, there's as they move to the left, there are policies that if as you move to the left looks somewhat similar to what we have had on the right before, right? It's kind of that weird thing where what's old is new. Things that one party would have never backed. Now it seems like they might be. And so I think as we get closer to November, it's gonna be super interesting as people start forcing the healthcare issue, because they're going to start getting the questions, right? It has to happen. Seeing if we start to see some of that overlap, even if it's unintentional, with some of the ideas for controlling costs.
Here's a few quick examples of how both parties are actually really the same. One is with the prescription drug pricing. That legislation that happened under President Biden, that President Biden takes credit for, that started under President Trump. That was a Trump idea
in 2016,
got done by Biden, but it was the same drug idea. in a similar thing around employers being able to give their employees money to get out of health insurance and just give people tax preferred money like a 401k
Yep.
style healthcare defined contribution. That started under President Obama with QSERA, which was the legislation for small employers. They could give tax preferred money. And then President Trump expanded that effectively with ICRA. ICRA and QSERA were the same. It was just taking the lid off and offering that for everybody with a few minor differences.
Yes.
But if you look at actual policy in the last 8 years, Republicans and Democrats have been trying to do the exact same things.
Yep. Well, with that statement right there, I think we'll wrap it up. What'll be cool is kind of watching what's like I was saying, what they're saying over the next few months here, seeing if kind of what we're guessing is borne out if we see some overlap with some of the old ideas. But we hope you enjoyed today's conversation. It doesn't have to be the end of the conversation. If you want to reach out to your Holmes Murphy representative, they know how to get in touch with us. We're always happy to talk about this stuff. But thank you very much for tuning into today's episode, and we hope you join us for episode number 3.